An actionable anti-racism plan for geoscience organizations, huh? All right, I'm game. Let's have a look at this, and it's time for another response video. So this article crossed my Twitter feed at some point, and it caught my attention, as per usual, because of the last article that I reviewed that was a nature article, which made some poor assertions at best. So I decided it would be good to look into this one, considering this is something they are suggesting that all geoscience organizations, all things that do science, are related to geoscience, which would include my own field in climate science, do all these things. So I think it's a good idea to review this particular article, and we're going to get into some things here and make some responses. So I'm not going to worry too much about the abstract here. There are some things, I skimmed this earlier, so I know there's some specific things that I want to hit. And it's actually straight out of the gate in the background. Racism thrives in geoscience. Geoscience organizations function alongside the same racist ideologies and practices shaping society. In North America, the historical legacy of racism, for example. All right, straight out of the gate, this statement. Citation here. The citation goes to another Nature article, and here's the thing with that. This particular one on race and racism in the geosciences, which was December of 2019. The article I'm looking at now, of course, was just published in June 22nd, 2021. And here is the fun thing with this. I guess you could say, you show me disparity, you do not show me the reason for the disparity. I agree with you. There are disparities. But saying there's a disparity and presuming that's the result of racism, or any number of different things, sorry, that's a logical fallacy, actually. And you're referencing to this article that is built upon a logical fallacy. Let's see. No, yeah, 90% worded with white people. We know that. 3.8. Yeah, all these are numbers that, yeah, they're showing me disparities. But that doesn't show me the reason why the disparity exists. So I gotta point this out for the authors. That is a logical fallacy. You are showing me a disparity. You are not showing me the reason why the disparity exists. You are assuming the reason why the disparity exists, which doesn't surprise me because this happens a lot with postmodernist thought. They tend not to do very well with the understanding of logic, actually. Nor do they actually think very highly of the scientific method. It's very interesting. Most postmodern research is actually either, shall we say, kind of doesn't care about the scientific method or is openly hostile to it. And so that's a fun thing here. So, yeah, okay, logical fallacy, and I'll get into that in a second, but the authors of the original article here on actionable anti-racism science plan here, racism has led to the geosciences being one of the least diverse fields here. I will point out that I clicked on this link earlier, actually, and that link is broken. That doesn't link to anything. It gives me a file not found error. In fact, I'll click on it right now for you and see if it shows up. We'll see if it finally shows up. Yep, error, not found. Congratulations, you put a bogus link into your article. There. So let's see here. Prisoner killed. Racism. So I'm guessing probably, not knowing for sure because I can't find it right now and I don't have I'm not going to go worry about defining it yet. National finds Doctor Special Report. My guess is this is another thing showing disparities, but not showing why those disparities exist. And that's the problem here, is that you are telling me these are disparities that exist. You are telling me these are disparities that exist, you not telling me why. Multiple times over. You are assuming, authors of this article, you are assuming why. And in fairness, I have not looked up who the authors of this article is. I have no idea what their races are. I have no idea what backgrounds are, anything like that. Haven't looked any of that up, so I have absolutely no idea. So saying it out of having no idea what races, genders, anything like that, these people are. But we'll see. Go on forward. Statements, yeah. However, these statements often fail to account. We assert that these statements of support, though important first steps, are generally ineffective at assisting minoritized people. In fighting racism or discrimination, certainly, yeah, we know there's a lack of diversity in the geosciences. Cannot be effective. How do you know that? How do you know that? You're assuming that racism and discrimination is the reason for the lack of diversity. But are you sure? How do you know? What percentage of the disparities that exist is the result of racism and discrimination? Can you give me a number on that? Where's the analysis on it? Can you prove it? Ooh, I get to ask for proof. Here's the thing. I'm going to go to this article from Quillette, actually. Quillette published this article in 2019, Why White Privilege is Wrong. And I think actually this article also applies to the other article where they're bringing up the anti-racist notions of Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, Kimberly Crenshaw, and the like, which has unfortunately got very flawed logic in all of them if you read some careful reviewers and critiques of them, which is unfortunate that people are doing this, but this is a great article, actually, and it makes the point of the logical fallacy that I want to mention that is unfortunately extremely typical in a lot of the anti-racism literature. Many people enjoy invoking race, I should say, as an explanation for all sorts of things. It is a shared pastime for both the far left and far right. The media expend vast sums of money and effort to ensure we don't escape discussions about race as something that is or should be important. This vocal minority of political extremists and news broadcasters has directed our attention away from more powerful causal explanations that underlie group outcomes. Perverse incentives for these two groups have made race a more prominent feature of our lives. As a consequence, white privilege has become the favored explanation for differences in group outcomes among many educated people. But unintentional or otherwise, by attributing success to white privilege, affluent individuals who invoke this mistaken idea thwart the ambitions of those who are seeking success, but who are also lacking in privilege. If we want to not only understand differences in group outcomes, but also mend them, we need a more robust and less ideological framework. And that's my point with what that article is I think it is flagrantly ideological. The pitfalls of one-thingism. The presumption that social groups should be proportionally represented in all activities and institutions is a fallacy that goes against key statistical laws. In nature, there is nothing resembling, representatively equal outcomes. Grossly unequal distribution of outcomes are the rule, not the exception. What they're getting at here that's related to this other article is the notion that because there are unequal outcomes, it must be the result of racism and discrimination. No, it's not necessarily true. And there is a premise is like, for an example, African Americans represent 13% of the population in the U.S., therefore they should be represented at least 13% in every different discipline and what have you. Okay, that's the thing, but why are you asking for equal outcomes here? But it's presumed that the unequal outcome is the result of racism, or systemic racism, if you will. Here are a few examples. More than 80% of the donut shops in California are owned by people of Cambodian ancestry. During the 1960s, although the Chinese minority in Malaysia was only 36% of the population, they comprised between 80 and 90% of all university students in medicine and science and engineering. In the early 20th century, Scots made up 4/5 of the world's sugar processing machinery. In 1937, 91% of all grocers licensed in Vancouver were held by people of Japanese ancestry. Group disparities often prompt explanations for why these disparities exist. Impersonal factors such as crop failures, birth order, geographic settings, technological advances, and demographic differences are all potential explanations. But as economist Thomas Sowell points out, these, quote, morally neutral factors seem to attract far less attention than other causal factors which stir moral outrage. If something is salient, which is to say attention-seizing, then it must be causal. And indeed, discrimination is something we are quick to lock our attention onto unfailingly serves as a popular explanation for differences in group outcomes. And that is very true of Kendi's logic of the entirety of critical race theory. They see disparate outcomes, any disparity as being the result of racism. And that is the assumption the other authors are making, which is not necessarily true. For the proponents of white privilege, differential outcomes are a product of nefarious interventionism past and present. I would say also this is for the folks who are advocating for systemic racism associated with critical race theory. Were it not for those, meddling racists, equal outcomes would exist. However, disparities do not imply discrimination. This, in fact, is a classic fallacy known as affirming the consequent. Plainly, it means to mistakenly attribute an outcome to a previous event, even though such an outcome could be the result of many other events. Take the true statement: if it is raining, then the grass is wet. Upon seeing wet grass, you infer that it is raining. This is an error, as the grass could be wet for any number of other reasons. Now take the statement: if discrimination exists, then differences in outcome will arise. This again is a true conditional statement. But if differences in outcome arise, that does not imply that discrimination exists. We easily fall into this trap, all the more when salient factors like race or other physical features are involved. This is the logical fallacy that is very classic of most that are pushing the systemic racism, the notions of critical race theory, intersectionality, and the rest, is that if there's disparity, all discrimination is the reason. No, it's not necessarily true. And that is the key assumption that underlies that entire Nature article, is the assumption that given disparity, discrimination must be the reason. That is not necessarily true. Historical discrimination does not necessarily translate into the present. And there could be very many reasons. Not to say that it doesn't. I'm not saying that it doesn't, and they don't say that in this particular article from Quillette either. The problem with white privilege is its monocausal disposition, one-thingism. It assumes discrimination, and only discrimination can neatly explain the intricacies of group outcomes. This, of course, flies in the face of social science research, where many factors together best explain a complicated phenomenon, I should say. For instance, Robert Plomin, in his book Blueprint, examines differences in academic achievement among boys and girls. Less than 1% of academic achievement can be explained by sex. Put differently, knowing whether a child is a boy or a girl tells you nothing, virtually nothing, about their grades. But sex is salient and therefore easy to invoke when people observe differences in outcomes. Even obvious factors, when taken together, don't fully explain outcomes. What predicts how well someone does in college? Some might say secondary school grades or SAT scores. Others might say social class is what matters most. However, research indicates that socioeconomic status, high school grades, and standardized test scores combined only account for 41% of the difference in college grades. Granted, 41% is a lot by social science standards, but none of these factors come close to fully explaining the differences in academic achievement among college students. On this channel, I have harped many times about why the university is important and why I've been critiquing things going on in universities, because it's where we train the next generation of scientists. And that's why this becomes incredibly important to me to say, no, it is not necessarily discrimination that is the reason for every disparity. I'm sorry, I am not going to buy on that oversimplistic explanation for things. There's a lot of reasons why discrimination can be a factor. I'm not going to ignore that. I'm not going to say that it's impossible. Not going to say that having known people who have been discriminated against, having had members of my family who've been discriminated against, interestingly for their ideological worldview, even as I have, as a conservative in academia, have experienced a decent amount of unpleasantness in my career from fellow academics, which reminds me of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology's recent report in March. 70% of conservative academics report working in a hostile departmental climate. Notice that's something that's not mentioned in the other article, but we'll get back to that in a second. And this article goes on to talk about 4 other options. And so one of the biggest things that I want to see, that I'm unfortunately not seeing from everybody pushing the notion that racism is the reason, discrimination is the reason. Really, my honest research question that I have not seen anybody answer, honest to God, and I could be wrong, please send me the article, I would be happy to see it. What percentage of the difference between groups of people going into sciences, what percentage of that disparity is actually the result of discrimination or racism? What percentage? Can you answer me that? Can you give me a number? Give me a percentage. Show me this study. I want to critique it. Because right now, you're not giving me anything. And so I'm not going to buy it. And yes, I have read things like read the background literature from things like Unlearning Racism and Geosciences. I have read a lot of that, to be honest, and you still have not given me an answer. And that's the thing that disturbs me with all this is that scientists are going off with what seems salient rather than actually looking for the reason why. Scientists are failing at the job of being scientists. Let's put it that way. All right. I'm not going to go through the rest of this Quillette article. That wasn't the point. I just wanted to bring this up to make the point. Although there's a lot of good stuff in this article, it's really, really long here. But, yeah, no. He actually makes a good point in here that I think is relevant to this situation. So, attitudes to work differ among the same groups in society. In White Liberals and Black Rednecks, Thomas Sowell details the lack of work ethic among American antebellum Southern whites relative to the German immigrants who painstakingly dug up trees by their roots when clearing the land for farming. Southern whites simply cut down the tree and plowed around the stump. There were similar contrasts in the production of dairy products. Whereas the South had 40% of the dairy cows in the U.S. in 1860, they produced just 20% of the butter and only 1% of cheese. This demonstrates how cultural values affect outcomes within members of the same racial group. Consider differences in group outcomes among native and foreign-born blacks. Despite New York being the principal destination of blacks from the Caribbean, this group is outnumbered by a factor of 4 by native-born American blacks. Nevertheless, the first black borough presidents of Manhattan were West Indians. As late as 1970, the highest-ranking blacks in New York's police department were West Indians, as were all the black federal judges in the city. 1970 census data showed that black West Indian families in the New York metropolitan area had 28% higher incomes than the families of American blacks. Furthermore, the incomes of second-generation West Indian black families living in the same area exceeded that of black families by 58%. Studies published in 2004 revealed that an absolute majority of black college alumni were West Indian or African immigrants, or the children of these immigrants. Neither race nor racism can explain these differences, nor can slavery, because West Indian blacks, like native-born blacks, have also experienced a history of slavery. A more plausible explanation is the culture. A study of West Indian blacks in the United States noted they possessed a zest for learning that surpassed native-born Americans of any race. Culture matters. Researcher David Austin Smith and Roland G. Fryer Jr. note that, quote, black peers and communities impose costs on their members who try to, quote, act white. And actually, this I have heard, because a few friends of mine who are outside academia who are also black have said something very similar to me when they were intent upon studying and what have you in high school. They were looked upon and ridiculed. So that is a thing that matters here too. And that reminds me also, because there's another article in Quillette which actually talked about this. It was physics. It was the department chair of a physics department in Ohio, and he was trying very hard to recruit black professors into the physics department that he ran, and he wondered why he couldn't get it, and so he backtraced it and found out the local schools were so poor, so dirt broke, that they weren't even teaching science. The students that were in those schools, regardless of their race, had no idea what a scientist even was. So part of the disparity problem, I really have to wonder, is just an issue of socioeconomic and class, and therefore, are we making sure we go into those communities and, improve those communities and do something to help improve all of that so that students even get the opportunity to know what a scientist is. To this extent, Fryer and Torelli, using 2 nationally representative data sets, found that blacks were more likely to associate good grades with unpopularity. Again, this is another study. That's not necessarily my opinion. And this is not a generality. They're saying more likely, not all blacks here also. So tough luck if you don't like me saying it. I'm just quoting from the article, so don't go too crazy on me here. In fact, the researchers estimated by eliminating the difference between blacks and whites on their views on grades and popularity would reduce the black-white test score gap by 10%, effort gap by 40%, and homework completion gap by 60%. But the point that I'm making here is that there's more to it than just racism or systemic racism, something in the sky here that is part of the problem. I agree, and I acknowledge there's disparities with respect to scientists. Really, I do acknowledge that. I disagree with the reason why. And that's why I want, in all seriousness, an answer to my one particular question. Because this article cites data showing disparities. Does not prove that racism is actually thriving in the geosciences. Sorry, don't buy it. That link doesn't prove anything. Nor does this one, I suspect, but that link is broken. So I don't honestly know what you're looking for with that. see, ignored or erased. Okay. So that's the biggest thing that I really want from this article. So I think the beginning premise is flawed to begin with here. I think the beginning premise of this is extremely flawed. Well, many people understanding knowledge. Okay. This is critical race theory and a thing, and it's fascinating because critical race theory on one hand says it's what is it? It's an aspect of whiteness to have either or thinking, and yet that's either or thinking right now. You're either non-racist or you're either racist or anti-racist, I believe is what Kendi's version of it is. Okay, anti-racism requires action. Yeah. Whatever. There's lots of assumptions early on in this, and nothing that is actually proven, I'm noticing. Alrighty. Alright, so let's go on into the actual things here. Oh, and I think... Okay, actually, I do want to get into this section here. So, for an organization to be anti-racist and equitable, again, my immediate question when I see equitable is, do you mean equality of outcome? Or do you mean equality of opportunity? Because if it's equality of opportunity, I'm game. If it's equality of outcome, no, because that's usually led to totalitarian societies as we go through history. Just a side note. It needs to ask and answer some difficult and yet important questions. Who is in the organization? Who benefits from the status quo? Who holds power and who feels safe? I'll give you a clue right now. I'm a conservative in the academic institution I work for. There are days when I feel great, feel welcome. There are days when I feel like this is a shitty dumpster fire and I don't belong here. There's a lot of those days, all right? Do you think that doesn't happen? Technically, I'm in the minority with my political opinions. Anyway, who is left out, who is powerless, who feels unsafe, and ultimately why? Why do these differences exist? Why do these differences exist? Considering that you made an interesting assumption right at the start about why some of these things exist, and you're presuming it's because racism, fascinating that you even asked this question. You answered the question at the beginning, you know that? With your assumption that racism is the reason. Anyway, in considering these questions, this group consisting of BIPOC, white, LGBTQ, straight, disabled, abled, immigrant, non-immigrant, women, men, and genderqueer, identifies 20 concrete actions that must be taken to become anti-racist. That organizations must take. My apologies, I misread that. 6 constructs. Okay. So, that's all nice and well and good. A question that I would have immediately here is, does diversity for you all include viewpoint diversity? Seriously, does it or does it not? Or are you all going to jump down my throat because I disagree with you on the premise to begin with? Yeah. This is what is disappointing for me and really concerning, because there's very little acknowledgement that with different ethnicities, different cultures, different worldviews, there are very different ways of thinking about this problem. And I don't think these individuals, I haven't read all of the actions they have here yet, but I have a very sneaking suspicion that they are very ideologically driven. Because they all share the same viewpoint, that the fundamental premise is correct. When there are those of us who do not share that premise being correct. We share agreement that there's a disparity there. I don't agree with the underlying premise of why, but I do want to address that disparity. You all probably won't bother working with me because I don't agree with you on the fundamental premise. Just a guess. I could be very wrong on that, just a guess. In considering anti-racism in the geosciences, we can't ignore the intersecting identities of marginalized people. Okay, that's intersectionality that they're talking about here, and the idea is basically, for example, a person who is black has some marginalization and is oppressed to some degree, but somebody who is black and a woman has more, or somebody has more intersection because women are oppressed by men. Somebody who is black and trans, even more oppressed in the idea of intersectionality. Jordan Peterson actually did a wonderful takedown of intersectionality at one point, and pointing out the flaw with it is that it has to stop categorizing people somewhere. You can't go beyond all these different things that are listed up here. It has to stop somewhere. Otherwise, you can keep adding categories and categories and categories and categories until you get to the individual. to so many categories that you are defining a single individual. You could keep on going doing that, but that's a flaw with intersectionality. They have to stop somewhere to maintain some kind of group. Anyway, we must acknowledge the added burden of inequalities and oppression experienced by people with communities with intersections. Focusing on one axis, you're only focusing on one axis of diversity yourself. I've already said this once before. It's like, for all the discussion here about improving diversity, it very much seems that this group of people cares nothing for viewpoint diversity when I'm reading this. And so it's hard for me to want to work with anybody when you don't seem to be interested in learning and understanding my worldview. I'm happy to try and understand yours. But you don't seem to care for viewpoint diversity, nor I don't know that you'd be interested in, well, I'm not going to say that, but while a single approach to anti-discrimination cannot work for all groups, explicit anti-racist policies will lift all minoritized identities in a ripple effect. Can you prove it? For example, reevaluating fieldwork policies. Okay, hold on. Similarly, the presence of BIPOC community becomes important. Okay, this part I believe. I actually released a video on this on my channel not too long ago. There's a great piece written by, and if I'm skipping through a few things, I really don't have the time to go through the entirety of the article, but I encourage you to read it. Community is important because if not adequately prepared, white mentors or other mentors with dissimilar identities from those of the mentee will frankly do more harm than good. I got a question. Why not just relate to people as individuals? Why not just treat someone as the person in front of you and talk with them about their issues and try to build an understanding? Martin Luther King was actually a big fan of personalism, which is the idea that you can see it in his writings, actually. You have an internal soul that is uniquely yours and cannot be fully understood by anybody else, but that's how you build bridges, is trying to understand that in deep, deep personal individual sense of self that you have. Personalism as a philosophy was an interesting one. Let's see. White mentors. Achieving anti-racism requires two-way communication, trust building, and active listening. That's true. I agree with that. Actually, very much agree with that. Believing the experiences of BIPOC. Okay. I did a video on my channel, released previously, on the question of, does experience determine thought? And I was commenting on a piece by Dr. Rendell Kennedy, who's a law school professor, and the piece itself was entitled On the Authority of Experience in Black Thought. And he made a very, very good point about it that you need to understand here when you're reading a line like this, in that experience doesn't determine, having an experience itself doesn't determine what you think about that experience. It doesn't determine the meaning that you give to that experience. And what Dr. Kennedy went through in his article was the many different thinkers, black thinkers, through U.S. history, and black people through U.S. history, and how divergent and different and diverse their thoughts were. Which is, again, where I come back, viewpoint diversity is incredibly important. And he made the point with it because you had differences from the beginning of the revolution in the 1700s in 1776 to the present. You have very different thoughts among black leaders and black people. And so you have to ask the question, if they all had the same experiences. A good example that he walked through in the article, actually, was the difference between Justice Thurgood Marshall and Justice Clarence Thomas. They both had very similar life experiences, both experienced racism themselves, but they had very different policies and thoughts in response to how to address it. Thurgood Marshall wanted a more egalitarian approach, and Clarence Thomas did not. He was very much vehemently against it, which, by the way, he just had his birthday recently. Happy birthday, Clarence Thomas. Before all else, organizations must... and that's the reason I want to bring that up, is because this is why viewpoint diversity matters so much. And yet, it goes so unacknowledged. And yet it is so critical to actually doing science, is to actually be able to tolerate diverse viewpoints, work with diverse viewpoints, understand each other. How can you even begin to do science if you cannot understand that? And how can you even begin to do actionable science if you cannot understand diverse viewpoints and opinions? So one of the reasons I'm going to say that is that two people of the exact same race, exact same gender, exact same whatever, can have the exact same experience and come and give different meaning to it. A prime example is how everybody freaked out when Senator Tim Scott refused to say there was systemic racism, and he has experienced racism himself. He has a different worldview from you. Can you tolerate that? So, the other thing is just like I would interrogate. I would not necessarily just immediately believe somebody's experience. I would sympathize with them. I would empathize with them. But part of being a good friend and part of being a good person is challenging that to make sure that your interpretation of the experience is correct. You know? Was it what you thought it was, or was it not? And something where it's explicitly racist, yeah. I'm dead on. I'm there with you. I wouldn't put a damn thing there. But something where it's just a misunderstanding, and there was one person's interpretation, another person's interpretation. I had that happen with my boss not too long ago. My boss inadvertently, I interpreted her comment to mean that she put me in charge of something because I'm a woman and not because I'm capable. I misinterpreted that. I really was about to rip her head off until I calmed down and realized, hold on a second, think about it. Did she really mean that? Intent does matter also in these things. Anyway. Before all else, organizations must collect data on the experiences of historically marginalized and excluded groups and use these data to engage in action-oriented conversations. Yeah, you know what? I'd be fine with that. Actually, I'm kind of fine with that because, you want to know, and to be honest, I would be curious to see if some of those things are actually happening in different institutions. And again, not just believing the experiences, but challenging it. Challenging it, how is the interpretation right? Why are you interpreting that way? Making sure the worldview's not necessarily biasing a person to believe something. Here, so proactive communication is vital, lest emergent events force organizations. Yep. Okay. Values. Many organizations have publicly declared themselves to be anti-racist. First, organizations should ensure that their anti-racism and anti-discrimination statements, including anticipated actions and expected outcomes, are shared publicly and accessibly. Second, anti-racism and anti-discrimination language should be explicitly adopted in code of ethics and conduct. Problem with this is my only concern with this immediately straight out of the gate is it's going to be vague. It's going to be vague. And if you watch the other video on the Is Diversity Training Effective, you might see some things here. I'm going to skip through a little bit because I know this article is getting long and I know there were some other things. Okay. Organizations for their actions or inactions. See, there was something I talked about in another video recently where there is a university that is incorporating anti-racism into its hiring and promotion, what have you, and the Chronicle of Higher Education covered it where they pointed out the conditions for doing that are flagrantly ideological. So are you then going to shut out people like Dr. Glenn Lowry, Dr. Shelby Steele, and Dr. John McWhorter, who do not agree with this anti-racism stuff as proposed by Kendi and D'Angelo and Crenshaw and the rest? They don't agree with the underlying premise the same as I do. And all three of those authors, I shouldn't even have to say this, but all three of those people I just mentioned are themselves distinguished professors and Black. Don't agree with any of it. A clear reflection of values. All right, access. Organizations can lead or just make programs safe for and accessible to. Okay. Yeah, I mean, people getting hurt, people getting injured, people getting attacked, those are things, yes. Best practices for making programs safe and accessible to everyone, absolutely, I'm fine with that. If safe means you're not going to hear an offensive word, sorry, you're coddling somebody at that point, but, yeah, I mean, you shouldn't have to deal with racist slurs, maybe I could see that, but, you're going to get out into the real world eventually, and, well, I could see it going both ways. This is where it's kind of vague, because I would like to know, what do you mean by safe? That's the thing with that. What do you mean by safe? This requirement includes into all space where geoscience in the file in the laboratories by encouraging the reevaluation of training. Okay, this goes back to the Chronicle in higher education article. Again, a lot of the anti-racism DEI stuff right now is flagrantly ideological, and there are many, many people who do not agree with it. Are you willing to sacrifice brilliant minds of all races, genders, sexes, all that, if it means that you get all these ideological requirements in there? Because there's going to be a lot of people who don't agree, myself included, and I'm not going to abide by something that is flagrantly ideological in violation of my own values and how I treat people. I will not do it. And invest in spaces like HBCUs, serve BIPOC and other marginalized geosciences in this effort. Okay. Inclusion. This necessitates hiring BIPOC and other marginalized experts to offer recurring trainings to educate train leaders, staff members, and... Okay. You guys should go watch the Is Diversity Training Effective video on this channel, because the research shows that a lot of diversity trainings, particularly when they're mandatory, are ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. This will not help. Thus, organizations should recognize how current and professional expectations negatively impact BIPOC members and make appropriate changes. I like to see you prove that prior sentence. For example, current expectations around manners, clothing, hair, professional attire, language, and diction are all racist at their core. Can you prove that? Because I noticed you don't have a citation there. And current Yeah, no. You gotta give me more than that. Sorry. Equity. Again, does equity mean equal outcomes or equality of opportunity? Question. Review of... Okay. So, here's a question. Would you promote somebody just because they are of a particular race or whatever? Because you got to be careful with that. In the U.S., that can be considered a flagrant violation of the Civil Rights Act. Just a note. Therefore, in addition to supporting minority-targeted initiatives and programs, organizations to directly sponsor inclusion networking events... Yeah, no, I'm fine with that. Go for it. You want to market to anybody who's of a particular race? Go for it. I'm game. I'd be there with you. I'd be there talking with folks. Doing that too. Absolutely. To achieve this, organizations must diversify their candidate pool and their awards towards selecting committees. Okay, one thing I would point out here, the research that shows that 70% of conservative academics work in a hostile work environment also shows that there's a significant percentage of administrators that will discriminate in hiring, admissions, funding, and promotions if the applicant is conservative, discriminating against them. Just a note there that, yes, if diversity is here, if diversity in this includes diversity of viewpoint, not just diversity of skin tone, I am all there. I'm there with you. Honest to goodness, I am there with you. Because we need people who think very differently, not just look different from each other. Organizations can address pay inequities by actively advocating for creating for income parity. Further pay inequity exists. This inequity is... I'd love to see a reference for that. I'm just noticing there's not one there. It's hard for me to comment on that if you don't actually give me a reference for that. Organizations can address pay inequities by actively advocating for and creating accountability measures. Yeah, I can't comment on that one because you can't give me anything to show. You're not giving me anything to prove that. These measures should also equally compensate BIPOC and other marginalized citizens for all paid organizational duties. Yeah, everybody should get the same pay. Again, you're not necessarily proving to me that they don't already. That's the thing. I just want to see the citation. I'm just asking you to prove it. Goodness. Oh, that's a handy little thing here. Just anti-racism, historical wrongdoings of... To start, each geoscience organization should identify and acknowledge the ways that it has failed BIPOC and other marginalized members, both structurally and individually, followed by taking specific actions to address these failures. I said this in another video. There's a difference between science and wisdom. Science itself is a process by which we acquire knowledge. And the norm of universalism in science actually says that anyone can do science regardless of their race, sex, gender, and all the rest. Are we perfect at implementing that? No. Scientists are people in their time with moral compasses and sometimes a lack thereof. And the question is the difference between science and wisdom involved in that. I commented this more on the peril of politicizing science, which was a great piece that Professor Krylov wrote. And she's a chemist, actually, too, so related field here. Do you say something is evil and ruin something if someone did something awful? Do you change everything just because you don't like something about someone's personal life? Good example, Marie Curie. She was discouraged from attending the Nobel Prize event because she got into an affair with somebody after her husband died. And she said, you know what, I'm coming anyway because the thing that happened in my personal life has no relevance on my professional work. And she was right to do that. She was right to do that. And she was right to say that, and it's still right now. What happened in a person's opinions and values outside of what they do professionally should not matter, necessarily. That's not to say that this isn't relevant to talk about. I've said it before myself. Bastardized science has done some horrible thing, because scientists in their time are people of their time. And sometimes they hold values themselves that are abhorrent. I get it. Really, I do. A good example of what I talked about in the prior video was the eugenics program in North Carolina was the result of bastardized science, and it resulted in the forced sterilization of numbers of African Americans. It was horrific based on bastardized science. That does not necessarily make an entire organization of science or an entire discipline evil. That is a very poor way to think about it. Why are you thinking that we are not better than our past? Also, I question I question saying that everything about the colonial times was utterly bad. Yes, there were lots of things that were bad. I am not discounting that. But can you think and imagine what would be different now if it hadn't happened? What would be very different, both positive and negative? And you probably can't figure that out. You probably can't imagine that. That's a lot of history to go back through and rewrite if it never happened. Geoscience organizations ongoing in erasure of Indus knowledge through colonial practice. Yeah, I know that happened. Again, some specific examples of things to do would be great. Necessarily. It's funny. I do remember reading a study about the land acknowledgement statements, in which the vast majority of the participants from the different tribal nations didn't care if there was a land acknowledgement statement. So, I wondered how much it matters, actually. Here, and that's a fair question to ask, I think. Colonialism, personalism. You're going off and off about everything in the past. Must be included as engaged stakeholders. Okay, wait a minute. Organizations must also acknowledge environmental injustice caused by geoscience endeavors, negatively affected by environmental hazards. Okay. Therefore, BIPOC communities must be included as engaged stakeholders to participate in any environmental action, research, and resource extraction happening within their spaces. Okay. Something about that just rings very strange, and I just can't put my finger on it. Maybe it'll occur to me later. In addition, acknowledging that natural resources that help support us come from global extractive industries whose activities disproportionately impact. Again, I would ask for the statement the reference that proves that. Just because I haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I would ask for the reference that proves that. Additionally, although higher extractive industries attract BIPOC individuals at higher rates into the geosciences, organizations should also recognize, acknowledge, and strive to resolve similarly higher rates of attrition. Oh, okay. Slow down the attrition rate. Sure. So there's some of these things that I can see would actually be good just as general practice if if only for people who are not just minoritized in the things. Okay, so let's see. Enacting anti-racism requires planning. Is the right? These actions are quick. Do not alter structural racism, and by building on steps, fundamentally anti-racist. Okay. I'm going to point out that there's a lot of things in here, again, like I said, that some things might be good. Some of them are so vague that I'm not honestly sure. Some of them I'm just like, well, is it all bad as you think it is? And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of bad shit that happened in history. I'm not discounting that. But can you imagine what it'd be like if it was very different? Go back to that point in history and what would be different in here. And, you know, some of these things I do really wonder, you know, are you adopting ideals, professional requirements, and things that are at this point flagrantly ideological? Because if you are, you're going to drive away and decrease the viewpoint diversity, and you will lock the sciences ever more into groupthink on how to address these issues. And that's not welcome. It's honestly not. And as I said, the fundamental premise that racism is the reason for everything that goes on in this current time, and discrimination is the reason for every disparity, is fundamentally flawed. It's a logical fallacy. So you're building something based on a logical fallacy to me, which... Again, my basic question here with this is, what percentage of the disparities that you see is the result of discrimination or racism? What percentage? Can you prove it? Where's the study? Until I see that, I'm sorry. I can't buy on something that's built upon a logical fallacy and actually seems very devoid of considerations of viewpoint diversity, and the fact that there are many different people who have many different ways of thinking about racism, discrimination, and what have you, how to end it, what are the best practices, and what have you. And they don't seem very open to working with people on that. Just on a quick read here, considering that they have mostly Ibram X. Kendi and Kimberly Crenshaw kind of stuff, and Angela Davis, all those kinds of things are in here. And those are generally things where they do not like people who disagree. Most of the critical race theorists try to write off people who disagree, like Robin DiAngelo's whole theory of white fragility is a wonderful foible and a Kafka trap to get people to shut up if they disagree, because any disagreement on the part of a white person is apparently showing your white fragility. AKA, that's a Kafka trap, because DiAngelo assumes straight out of the gate that anyone who is white is racist, and if you're disagreeing, you're just showing that you're a racist. That's the Kafka trap. That is white fragility. Anyway, just kicks and giggles. I want to go down to the comments section. Wait a second, did they disappear? Ha! There was a comment section when I looked at this earlier today. I'm surprised it's disappeared. Well, I read this earlier today, and there were a couple of folks that put in some very, very stinging remarks themselves that were not pleased by this particular lack of particular scholarship. I don't think it was the best scholarship ever done here, that's for sure. Look, I get where they're coming from. I do want to see all these disparities end. I just think this is built on a logical fallacy that because disparity, therefore racism or discrimination is the reason why, when that's not necessarily true. I would actually like to see a lot of the analysis that was done for this article done in similar fashion for the scientific community, you know, to help us determine what things from what cultures and what have you, or why these things happen, which is what I think should be happening, instead of just going with the assumption that because of past racism we have current disparities, or because of there is a disparity is because racism. That's just me. So overall, that's my thoughts on this article. I know this video ran long. I hope you enjoyed. Please comment. Let me know what you think. I'd be curious to hear if the authors happen to hear from this and they have some thoughts. I know it might have been a bit harsh, but that's just usually the way I am when I'm reviewing any article and I'm talking off the cuff into a camera. So, yeah, I look forward to seeing your comments, your thoughts. Like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good jazz. Follow, come be a supporter on sciworthy.locals.com if you'd like more interactions with me and other scientists who are present there. Until next time, I'm Adrian, signing off. Stay curious, my friends.